woefully underfunded systems, and that within those systems, we get in fights about where dollars are allocated. In child welfare, folks who want to focus on prevention fight with folks who want to focus on foster care, when in effect, those are really different allocations of dollars. I don't necessarily hear child welfare fighting with education about spending of education dollars. Similarly, I think in education we get fights about who gets, what categorical dollars get distributed, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to argue that our power relationships are interesting, and this framework may not exactly match with this. But she suggests that you can do one of three responses to wicked problems. And one of them is an authoritative response where basically you take one, you vest control within one stakeholder. And I'm raising this as a possibility. We're not going to do it here, but I think we can think about other ways internationally that we think about child-serving systems, where countries like Finland and Great Britain, who recently dropped this initiative, basically have one child-serving system. There's no child welfare, there's no mental health. These are not really considered separate systems, but they're embedded together. And in the case, Finland does this around schools. So all the supports for families and kids are kind of tied up in schools. Another way potentially to resolve wicked problems are competitive, where you would pit stakeholders against each other. I'm not sure I'd want to pit the child welfare system versus the child mental health system. That doesn't seem like it's going to work. But then she finally argues that the other thing, though it takes time, is to aspire to collaborative strategies. I think this is a really important theme. Collaboration takes time. There's multiple levels of our collaborative problems. We, as panelists, were talking about the fact that within academia, our knowledge bases on these are very cleaved. There's a developmentally oriented child maltreatment literature. There's a child welfare services literature. There's school-oriented social work education literature. There's school reform literatures. So Jenny was arguing that we need to aspire to a transdisciplinary space. That's a collaborative effort. I think that we see collaboration problems if we're going to elect to have different systems of care for children. We need to better invest in that these are fragmented systems. And then I think Brian and Carlo noted the levels of collaborative work within districts and schools requisite in building smart supports. I think I finished on time. I actually had videos. Oh my, I was so worried about going over time, and I didn't go over time, so I'm going to say thank you. I'll take some questions.
Okay. Great. Does anyone have any questions? And if you do, it would be great to come to the microphone if you want to ask some individual questions. Yes.
Hi, thank you for those wonderful presentations. And Brian, I think your school district is very lucky to have you as a superintendent. I was thinking a little bit about what you're saying, and I want to, full disclosure, say my background is research. I'm not a teacher, and I don't work in the school districts. So I'm just wondering, I've heard a lot about teachers and how we have to kind of educate teachers to be more sensitive to these problems, which I think is critically important. But I'm thinking about also training teachers to have all these other skills that might not necessarily be 100% within their scope of service. So could we talk a little bit more about people who are supposed to kind of have this role, which I would think are guidance counselors or some other people who are more trained within that kind of mental health and developmental framework to provide these supports? Like, can we talk a little bit more about increasing their level of support maybe to the teachers? So all this stuff, I feel like the way it's being presented is that all this stuff is kind of happening with teachers and in the classrooms. And also thinking about that there's a large majority of kids that also are just there to be educated. And is that going to pull away from the education perhaps of other children if we're kind of infusing this support into the classroom? Basically what I'm saying is would you support kind of like the ancillary staff also helping with the teachers in these very, very difficult and very, very difficult problems?
Thank you for the question. That's a complex question. I found targeted, layered resources are necessary. I'll give you an example, and kind of the way our district operates. So when I became superintendent, my director of pupil services became my assistant superintendent, and we decided not to fill the director of pupil services position. My assistant superintendent retained all those things so we could hire a behavior specialist. This is a behavior specialist who's not an educator but is highly trained. And the behavior specialist was assigned to the elementary schools. One behavior specialist for 4 elementary schools, but she's very good at tracking data and interventions, and really nothing phases her. What's interesting is each year I do what are called Cracker Barrel meetings. I go and I meet with each faculty in October basically, and it's an open communication. And every year I would do this, I would hear a lot of concern and complaints about some of our high incident kids in terms of behavior. The behavior specialist was implemented 2 years ago, and it has improved, but what's really improved that the teachers aren't complaining at all about. Students. The students are still there, their behaviors are still there. Now we have somebody there who could help them, but it's really not, there's some critical incident response that this person supplies, but it's really modeling how to respond in those situations. So I think the narrative switch from teachers trying to prove that the students had concerns and problems to the district, basically, you need to know this is a problem, to thank you, and it's changed their orientation. So they are much more willing to provide this and to work toward this. It's not easy because she is kind of, our behavior specialist is kind of drop in the ocean. The real work is going to happen in the classroom. We can't continually provide external personnel, targeted personnel to solve all of these issues. The goal is to have teachers be better so that the number of students who need these targeted interventions is reduced to a more manageable number. So I think it's a combination, but truly the teacher skills are relevant. I love, for example, hiring teachers who have experience in urban environments. They don't complain. Nothing phases them. They have a comparative point. So they would say, well, I've seen a lot of this, and they set a good example. I've also seen, in terms of our hiring practices and what makes a good teacher, I can really boil it down to the concept of the best teachers have an internal locus of control. They believe they impact their surroundings. They believe they can have an effect. The teachers that struggle have an external locus of control. They believe things happen to them. How can I succeed with this child when the home life is like this, or the child does not study, or so on and so forth? So the best teachers have an internal locus of control, and they're never happy. They never feel like they're good enough. They always feel like there's something more that can be done. And so the best teachers are feeling guilty all the time, I suppose. But if you have those teachers, what you provide is support. You remove impediments, and a person like a behavior specialist or other personnel would be a support mechanism. If you have teachers with an external locus of control, there's nothing you can do that would be good enough if the child is still in the room. So it's a complex issue. I think it's important to acknowledge the issue, provide those resources, but really build the teacher skills and look for the teachers to kind of own the issue. And if you collaborate on that level, I think you can get there, but it's not easy. So.
Just to add to Brian's point, I really want to be cautious about the program or the intervention that we're developing. It's not to make turn teachers into therapists. The idea is that it's analogous to some of our parenting interventions. We're not turning parents into therapists. What we're doing is improving a lot of our parents' attunement to their children. It's creating more sensitive approaches to children, understanding what's going on, and then shifting the interaction. So if you remember my Bronfenbrenner from yesterday, it's how do we work within the microsystem to shift the proximal process, or in this case, the teacher-student relationship, so that development and learning in the classroom is more optimal. Similar, analogous to parent, our parent interventions. It's how do we create more sensitive, attuned parents so that the children are developing optimally. And in this sense, as Brian mentioned, we at the first tier, what we do is remove some of those concerns that could be circumvented, and so it's not a drain on the behavioral specialist, and then she can then focus on more pressing needs if needed.
Can I add? I want to push back a little bit too, that this construction of teachers as only doing academics, I think we need to push back on that narrative a bit too. Historic evidence would suggest that teachers did in the past have more expanded roles. In fact, the earliest school social workers were teachers. But that being said, I think anecdotally, my work with school social work practitioners really raises concerns about their credibility with teachers. That teachers often can hear information better from other teachers. And so some of this, it's how to deliver that support. Well, and I guess my third issue is that teachers often have stronger relationships with children than other support professionals have. And I do think that there are important boundary issues that we don't do a good job of preparing teachers for. So I guess it's all of this. And thinking of ways, yes, that we can support teachers to do their work, whether it's helping them lean in some situations, step back if there are boundary issues. But I guess that's all part of the relational work of teaching. Thanks.
Why don't we take one quick question and then we'll have a break and we'll get to some of the other Slido questions at the end of the presentation.
Dr. Stone, you just brought things so beautifully to a head there when you talked about whether it will be collaborative or competitive or authoritarian. And the one thing I would ask everyone involved in this work is, are they thinking about the dynamics from the state level funding sources that will influence everything else? And that was my question. I know every state has authority over education in that state. And so that's an issue that I think we ought to really focus on a little bit. And the other thing is that we don't have a national ethos concerning what we want for children in this country.
I think I think you brought the policy issues to a head, actually. Both of those, this goal issue that Americans think they agree, but we don't really fundamentally agree with what we want about children, and we don't really debate that. And then the second issue, I was going to leave it to the policy people this afternoon, this wicked funding issue. I said wicked problems, wicked systems. It's wicked funding in a state that doesn't really fund children and families.
Okay, thank you. We're going to take a break and we'll be back at 10:15.
It's okay.